so there's no action for us to take. We are going to move on to our planned hearing for the High-Speed Rail Authority. We're going to begin with an update on the 2016 High-Speed Rail Draft Business Plan, followed by an update on system construction, and then the bookend investments in Northern California and Southern California. And finally, we've reserved some additional time, a little bit unusual the way we're doing it today, but we've got a couple of panels that will augment our public comment. So thank you. Welcome, Mr. Richard. Welcome to you, and feel free to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of this committee, I'm Dan Richard. I'm the chair of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board. With me is our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Jeff Morales. I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing today to explore our draft business plan. And let me just also say, if I might, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to compliment your staff on a very comprehensive and I think fair, even-handed analysis of the plan. You have a lot of information that is there. We'd like to both be crisp and also provide adequate time for your questions and certainly for the public that you're affording an opportunity today. So I'm going to start with just touching on the high-level issues around our draft business plan. And I want to talk about what it means in terms of the cost of the program, the scope of the program, and the sequencing, our reasons for why we lay out the plan the way we did, and the import of what we've put before you. My colleague, Mr. Morales, will also talk about the construction update and fill in, and certainly will respond to your questions. Let me just start by reminding members of the public, something I know this committee knows very well, that this is a draft produced pursuant to statutory requirements. And we are in the period right now where we're accepting comments, not only from the public, but also input from funding partners, as well as, of course, members of this legislature. And there have already been 2 hearings, one in Assembly Transportation Committee and in a joint hearing of the Senate Transportation and the Senate Budget Subcommittees. And we've gotten good input from all of those hearings that will factor into our development of the final plan, which will be submitted to you prior to the May 1st statutory deadline. We've scheduled a board meeting in Anaheim to take public comments in Southern California. That'll be next week. And then another board meeting scheduled April 21st in San Jose, again to afford the public an opportunity to comment prior to our submittal to you on May 1st. So I just wanted to touch for a moment on the process. We believe that this draft business plan marks a critical inflection point in the development of the project. I don't need to remind any member of this committee or any member of the public that this is a large, complex, challenging undertaking. And it is an undertaking that has a lot of uncertainties associated with it, and I believe it always will. And one of the things that we've observed recently is that if we're doing our job correctly, we will be constantly looking ourselves and reporting to you and to the public about the ongoing risks of the project. And those will be changing and evolving as we go, but we will always need to be managing our costs, we will always need to be managing our scope, we'll always need to be managing our schedule. And at every juncture along the way, we need to have an honest assessment ourselves of where those things are and an early warning system for things that could go wrong. And we'll need to be talking about those. So to a certain extent, we live in a world where if we're doing our job right, there's always going to be somewhat of a question or a negative cast around the program, because we'll be talking about those things that we need to address and we need to deal with and we need to manage. And I just wanted to make that point very quickly. But we think that we've come to an important juncture here, because up until this point, we've been talking about planning for the system. We've been talking about aspirations for what might happen in what order. And for the first time, we're able to lay out for you and your colleagues and the members of the public a specific plan to get the first operating leg up and running, and to do it in a time frame that is foreseeable, and to do it in a way that meets not some, but all the requirements of Prop 1A of the Bond Act that sustains and launched this program. And those are the engineering standards of speed and time, as well as the very critical financial standard that we have to show that this segment can operate without an ongoing operating subsidy. And we are in a position to tell you that we can do that. First, I said I wanted to mention the cost. Our estimate today of the cost of the program is lower than it was prior to this business plan. And on an apples-to-apples basis, we basically see the cost of the system having declined from about $68 billion, and that number, by the way, is denominated in fully inflated costs over the life of the program. It's not a current year cost. It's a fully inflated cost of the program. It has gone from $68 billion on a like comparative basis to about $62 billion. We've taken $2 billion of that savings and increased the scope of what we're proposing to do in Southern California. So you'll see numbers that say this has gone from a proposed $68 billion to $64. It's really 68 to 62 plus $2 billion added back in to enhance the service in Southern California between Burbank, Los Angeles Union Station, and Anaheim. And my colleague, Mr. Morales, is going to focus on the critical importance of that corridor for the entire Southland, including the Inland Empire. And we are looking at upscoping that piece. So there is a reduction in the cost of the program. In terms of the scope, I think it's well understood by everybody now that we are proposing a different sequence. And I want to use that word deliberately because when we first came out with this, there were very great concerns, especially articulated from Southern California leaders, that somehow we were abandoning the South and turning around and heading to connect from the Central Valley to San Jose and the Silicon Valley. And I want to make it clear that our job is to build the 520-mile Phase 1 project from downtown San Francisco to LA and Anaheim, and then ultimately to position ourselves to complete Phase 2 to connect San Diego and to Sacramento. We're not cutting off anybody. We're not leaving anybody behind. What this business plan is about is the sequence of how we do that. And our focus was, and what drove us, was to look at what would get an operating segment up and running as soon as possible. And let me just say, this is a fiscal committee. There was basic math here. We looked at the available funds to us, both in hand or allocated, and they total about $20 billion. To connect the Central Valley to Los Angeles takes about $30 billion. To connect the Central Valley to the Silicon Valley takes about $20 billion. And so our decision was, instead of just building south and hoping that we can identify additional funds later on, that it was more important to get a segment up and running that met the provisions of the Bond Act and that provided an early opportunity for the operation of high-speed train service. And so our proposal is to take the basic structure that we're building in the Central Valley across what is basically 130 miles, but it's about 118 miles of construction, and then move from there through the Chowchilla area where we would be transitioning from north-south to east-west, over across the Pacheco Pass, up through Gilroy, up into San Jose. Now, you're going to hear today from one of our key funding partners, Caltrain, where we're working closely with them on the electrification of the Caltrain corridor. And so by connecting the Silicon Valley and the Central Valley, we also have the first connection up into San Francisco. And so there will be the opportunity for a one-seat ride into San Francisco albeit at lower speeds initially, just initially, between San Jose and San Francisco until further upgrades are made in that corridor, and we will talk about that. That corridor can be built by 2024. It can be operated by 2025. Our reasons, as I said, were basically the math of this and what we could do with available funds. But let me put that in a positive sense. We're now in a position where we know that we can deliver this and have it operating by 2025. Let me talk quickly about the import of what this means. It's not just about building any segment. The Central Valley to Silicon Valley segment turns out to have several really important attributes. First, one of the things we've talked about in the past is that there is tremendous latent private sector interest in this program. As built, this system will not be a publicly operated railroad in our business model. It will be a privately operated railroad. Once the government lays down the basic infrastructure for the first piece, the private sector has an opportunity to see what the ridership and revenue picture looks like. And what they have told us is that in the absence of our ability or public policy desire to provide any kind of floor or operating subsidy, they need some ridership history. When that happens, that unlocks the private sector latent potential here. And our business model, which is described in this draft business plan, is that as the system gets up and running, we would sell a concession to the private sector to come in and operate. And this is a business model that's been used around the world very successfully. And I think it's an example of a true public-private partnership where the public dollars go in first to reduce risk. The private sector then comes in and they bring their innovation, their efficiency, and their desire to enhance the service. We're very confident that that business model is the right business model. But to get there, we need to take that first step. So the first operating segment unlocks private sector dollars that then help us build out the rest of the system. And that's a key part of what we're trying to do here. And then this connection itself is, we think, vitally important, and we've been meeting with people in the technology sector in Silicon Valley. They see tremendous benefit here for providing a way to balance the terrible housing crisis they have in the Silicon Valley area, where homes are so expensive and unavailable, with the opportunity for people to live in the Central Valley and have quick connections to the Silicon Valley. And we already know that people live in the Central Valley and commute to the Silicon Valley. They do it by car, they do it by ACE train, and these are multi-hour commutes each way every day. If we are doing this in the right way, we can provide sustainable land use approaches to connecting the Silicon Valley and Central Valley and balancing jobs, investment, and housing. So those are key elements. Let me just mention two other things about the draft business plan. While we are very excited about the opportunity to get service up and running from Central Valley to Silicon Valley, there are immediate, important, critical investments in Southern California that should be happening now. And we have been working very closely since we appeared before this committee last with transportation leaders in Southern California. We had already entered into a $1 billion memorandum of understanding with Southern California transportation leaders. And this legislature in 2012 appropriated $500 million from the Bond Act proceeds to effectuate that MOU. And the other $500 million, we've committed to work with them, with Secretary Brian Kelly and the California Transportation Agency, to make sure that those dollars come together in Southern California. And one of the things I've been saying is San Jose may see trains first, but Southern California is going to see dollars first, because there's some critical grade separations and other things there that provide greater freight capacity, greater safety, unlock opportunities for Metrolink to serve the Inland Empire, and do other things in Southern California that we can talk about that are very important, and we are committed to those. Just as we are committed to the other MOU in the north, where the legislature appropriated $600 million of our bonds for the Caltrain electrification program that Mr. Gordon knows very well. So you're going to be focusing on the bookend investments. We continue to work very closely with our transportation partners, because the basic idea here is that while we talk about high-speed rail, what we believe and what this legislature has acknowledged in Senate Bill 1029 is that this is really part of a broader statewide rail modernization program that has to lift regional and local transportation systems as well as a spinal high-speed rail system. One last quick point. In order to fit the available dollars to this project scope, and I know there's been some commentary on this, we are basically saying that we're going to stop construction where it currently is at the limits of our fourth construction package in the Shafter area, and turn around and go to San Jose. That leaves a gap of about 22 miles down to Bakersfield. Now, I know it's popular to question the competence of people sitting in governmental agencies, but we did not wake up and decide that it was a really good idea to stop this thing in the middle of an almond orchard in Shafter. So I'd just like to say for the record that we don't believe that that's the sensible terminus in the southern end of this, so that you don't have to remind us that it's not. And what we've said is that it's more sensible to go to Bakersfield, which is an additional $2 billion to connect to Bakersfield. What we have indicated in our plan is that we would like to approach the federal government over the next 5 to 10 years to fill in a $2.9 billion gap that would not only connect to Bakersfield, but would further enhance the service between San Jose and San Francisco. Now, we're not foolish, and we're aware of the situation in Washington, but we think we're in a position to have a very different conversation now that we're talking about closing gaps, unlocking private sector dollars. And I'll just end with this. The $2.9 billion of additional investment that we'd like to really make this first segment hum would generate $4.7 billion of additional ridership revenue. And so it's a very significant return on the investment. And that correspondingly translates into an equal amount of potential private sector revenue, because they'd be buying the concession for the rights to capture that revenue. So we've already had conversations with our federal funding partners in the administration. They are going to work with us on this. Obviously, this will be a matter for the Congress, but we think that it's a sensible approach to talk about connecting all the way down into Bakersfield. So, lower cost. And Assemblymember Patterson, when I was here last, you looked at me and you asked me a direct question about what this business plan was going to say and whether our costs were going to go up. And I believe my answer to you, sir, was I expected the cost to go down, but it was going to take longer. And the costs are going down. It is going to take a couple of years longer. We're confident that the costs are on the trajectory that they are, especially for the north. And we have the opportunity now to get high-speed train service up and running in California, connecting two very vital economic regions, one that needs housing balance and the other that needs investment. And with that, I again want to thank the committee for this opportunity.
Welcome, Mr. Morales, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Jeff Morales, High Speed Rail. Mr. Richard has touched on most of the business plan points. What I want to do is quickly summarize some of the key elements and then talk briefly about construction and bookends. And I would echo the comments that I think the staff draft does an excellent job of laying out these issues, so we're not going to be repetitive with those. In the business plan, with working within the constraints of available funding, and it's the first time we can do that now because of the commitment of cap and trade, this plan identifies three key fundamentals to guide the program moving forward. One is, as has been noted, to get into operations as soon as possible. The reasons for that are to show people the benefits, get people riding on trains, start achieving the benefits of clean transportation here in the state and the connectivity elements, and of course, as has been noted, to engage the private sector at that point in the operation of it and bring in their capital. The second key element is to make as many concurrent investments as possible throughout the state. Reasons for that being to provide near-term benefits to local regional services, and then ultimately to use those as the building blocks to tie together the statewide system. And then the third is to prepare to move the entire program forward statewide by completing the environmental approvals, and we have that underway. So I'll just talk quickly about those three elements. The getting into revenue operations, as has been noted, we project, given the existing funding sources available, that the leg moving north from the southern terminus of our current construction in the Central Valley to San Jose can be done within the existing resources available to us, and that's the basis for that decision to go north. And we are talking about having a train up and running in 9 years based on that schedule. The environmental approvals for the sections outside of the Central Valley are underway and scheduled to be completed, targeted end of 2017, and then we would move right into construction following that. The plan lays out the business model for moving forward, and Mr. Richard noted the concession, but in terms of constructing the system, what we plan to do going forward is enter into a series of large design-build contracts for the remainder of the construction, a major P3 public-private partnership for the rail infrastructure and systems, separate procurement for rolling stock and associated facilities, and bringing on an operator early in the process so that the operator, who will be responsible ultimately for achieving the operational terms and conditions, can influence the construction and the capital decisions that go into what they will ultimately be operating. On the concurrent investment front, and it gets somewhat into the bookend investments, but we're working with partners throughout the state to make those investments. On the peninsula, we are working with Caltrain to advance the electrification project. At the same time, we're working with the ACE system and Capital Corridor to make improvements elsewhere in Northern California, and of course to invest in Southern California, key corridor. And I'll talk briefly about the Burbank-Anaheim corridor because that's really a critical one. It's a 45-mile segment that connects some of the key points throughout Southern California, a huge population base along that Burbank-Anaheim corridor. It's also home to the second busiest Amtrak line in the country, as well as major commuter operations and freight operations. There are very important near-term improvements that can be made in that corridor, things like grade separation projects in particular, that can provide near-term benefits for those operators, for Amtrak, for Metrolink, for Metro, and for freight, very importantly. And I'll give you a specific example. There's a existing at-grade crossing, which is the top PUC priority in the state. It's called Rosecrans-Marquardt, just south of Los Angeles. Just by separating that corridor, that will improve rail capacity throughout that corridor by about 60% for all users there. It will allow the completion of the last remaining triple track segment for freight through there, which will greatly improve freight. And we'll have dramatic improvements for Metrolink, including service going out to the Inland Empire that will benefit greatly, and again have tremendous safety and air quality benefits for the communities along those regions. And so our work with the locals is to accelerate those improvements and get those going, and in fact our goal working with our partners is to have that project underway this year. And again, they become the building blocks for ultimately full high-speed service getting there. The third element is, again, to prepare for the next steps. And what that really means is getting the environmental approvals in place statewide. We have 10 segments that we have to receive environmental approval for. We have all of those underway, working with our partners at both the state and the federal levels. Our target is to have all of those done by the end of 2017. That allows us to adapt to changing circumstances and move forward on each of those segments. And the draft plan does identify that we have all the funds in place to complete that environmental work. Quickly, I'll talk about construction, and the memo, again, does a great job of summarizing, but I'll hit some highlights. We have 3 major design-build contracts in place, executed and underway, about 115 miles of work that is now moving forward, about $3 billion worth of work. It's significant to note that those 3 bids all came in significantly below estimates. And we have used we're using the design-build process and have worked hard through the procurement process to take full advantage of competitive pressures within the industry and the incentives that they have to be creative and find ways to deliver things more effectively. I do want to note we are not assuming in the cost estimate, because we have dropped it, we have not assumed similar type of savings going forward. What we have done is look at very specific elements of those proposals, and where they can be applied elsewhere in the system, we have done so. But we're not just assuming continued low bid prices. We also reflect places where we're seeing price pressure, upward pressure. Some of the areas regarding third-party agreements, utility relocations, other things where we see estimates going up, and we have reflected that in the overall estimates as well. One important thing to note about our construction, because of our small business goal, we have 266 small businesses under contract today on the program. One of the very important things about a small business is that they tend to be local business, which means that we're creating jobs and economic activity in California, and it's really throughout the state. It's not, even though the construction is happening in the Central Valley, the participants are from all over the state, but you'll hear from some of those small businesses later today. 266, as I said, 90 of those are disadvantaged businesses. 32 of the 266 are disabled, veteran-owned business enterprises. So we're very, very proud of that and that element of the program. Lastly, on the bookend investments, as I noted, the Caltrain project on the peninsula is moving forward. You'll hear from them today, I believe, as well. The goal is to have that contract, well, 2 contracts, both for electric trains and for the electrification system, have those contracts awarded this year. We're working in partnership with Caltrain to make sure that that program moves forward. And it's significant that that electrification becomes, again, a building block for high-speed rail operating through the blended system that this legislature approved, and Mr. Gordon was an author of. In fact, that approach, having that electrification done by the time we reach San Jose will enable us to actually operate all the way to San Francisco. And then, again, in Southern California, we are working with our partner agencies. We have an MOU from 2012 that identifies a process and projects to invest with them jointly up until the year 2020. We're working on that. We have several notable projects that we're working on with our partners jointly, things like the SCRIP project at LA Union Station, which will allow the run-through tracks to come through and dramatically improve efficiency by something like 40% at LA Union Station, and have huge GHG benefits. The Rosecrans Marquardt grade crossing, and we're also working with LA Metro on property rights acquisitions at Union Station as well as part of that process. But again, working with all of the partner agencies who are signatories to that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you kind of meandered through issues 1, 2, and 3.
Correct.
Have you completed your presentations on all 3 of the issues?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I know we have panelists on issue 3, but not on issue 2. So I think if it's all right with members on the dais, we can withhold our questions unless there's something pressing until after we've heard from the panelists that are here to speak to issue number 3, the bookend investments, unless there's anything you want to add on to it. And LAO, you have some comments?
Sure.
Please proceed. Sorry, Ed. Rejiggering the agenda a little bit just to keep with the testimony that we've heard.
Jessica Peters
Welcome.
with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I think my comments relate primarily to issues 1 and 2 of on your agenda. The authority has explained the major features of their business plan. A couple of weeks ago, our office did put out a report with our review of the plan. In there, we highlight what we identify as the major features of the plan, as well as 3 primary issues for legislative consideration. So I won't repeat the presentation that you already heard from them, but I did want to point out a couple of things to expand upon certain elements in the draft business plan related to the funding for the project. So first, the business plan does identify a full funding package for the proposed initial operating segment into San Jose. This is a more complete funding package for any segment of the project that would be operable than the legislature has seen in prior business plans. Specifically, the plan identifies $28 billion in order to pay the costs of this segment. As the authority mentioned, $20.7 billion of this is related to capital costs, and then there's another roughly $7.5 billion in financing costs. The draft business plan does assume that a portion of the cost of constructing the project would be financed. Specifically, the plan assumes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A bonds, $4.2 billion of which has not yet been appropriated by the legislature, and so this would require a future action by the legislature to make these funds available. $3.2 billion in federal funds that have already been appropriated to the authority, and $17.8 billion from cap-and-trade auction revenues. And this would include auction revenues through the year 2050. In terms of how the authority would use the funds, they would use the funds through 2024 on a pay-as-you-go basis. That would cover about $5.3 billion of the cost of this operating segment. Then the authority also assumes about $13 billion in funds from 2025 through 2050. And these funds would support the proposed financing to pay the remainder of the cost of the initial operating segment. Specifically, the authority estimates this would generate about $5.2 billion in financing proceeds to pay for those capital costs up front through a securitization of these revenues, and with the balance of about $7.5 billion going for paying the financing costs that would be required under such a securitization. With regard to the funding plan for the remainder of the system, for Phase 1, San Francisco to Anaheim, the business plan does not identify a full funding plan for how the authority would pay the roughly $44 billion in costs to complete the system beyond the initial operating segment. As the authority has testified already, there's some different sources of funding that are contemplated that might be available, but the plan does not identify a way to fully pay for the cost of completing Phase 1 of the system. In terms of issues that we have identified for the legislature to consider, the first one is the uncertainties regarding the funding plan for Phase 1. And I'll speak to this in 2 different components. First, regarding the funding plan for the initial operating segment to San Jose. As I said previously, this is a more complete funding package for an operable segment of the system than the authority has presented in prior business plans, and so that's a step in the right direction. But we would note that about half of the funding that the business plan relies on would come from cap-and-trade auction revenues after the year 2020. It is our understanding that the cap-and-trade program is not authorized beyond the year 2020, and so this would appear to require legislative action in order to extend these funds. We think that that's something the legislature is going to want to consider on the merits of the cap-and-trade program and that program's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To the extent that you choose to extend that program, the funds could be available for high-speed rail, but we think it should be considered on its own merits. Even if those legal uncertainties were resolved and the cap-and-trade program were extended, we think the proposed securitization of cap-and-trade revenues over the longer term would require additional legislative action. The way that the continuous appropriation to the authority is currently structured, we don't think would be sufficient to provide the level of certainty that investors would need in order to facilitate a securitization. And so we think additional steps would be needed by the legislature. For example, you could change the appropriation to make the repayment of high-speed rail financing the first call on cap-and-trade auction revenues, or provide a certain minimum amount in order to provide the certainty that would be necessary in order to securitize that revenue stream over the long run. The other point regarding uncertainties for the funding plan is that the authority has not identified a complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. Under their plan, they would exhaust all of the identified funding sources to build the initial operating segment into San Jose. This would leave a funding gap of about $44 billion and no identified funding sources for how they would complete the system. As Mr. Richard had testified, the authority would plan to securitize operating revenues of the system once they get a portion of the system up and running. It's uncertain to us at this point, and I think even to the private sector, to what extent, how much operating revenue or net revenue there would be, or operating profit there would be. I think Mr. Richard indicated the private sector would like to see some actual numbers, and so there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and so it's unclear to us to what extent that would be an available funding source. Even if it did become available at the level that the authority is estimating, under their estimates, they would have roughly $3 to $7 billion that they could securitize from that initial operating segment, depending on the specific scope, that could be used to fund the rest of Phase 1. That amount falls significantly short of the amount necessary to fill that $44 billion funding gap to complete Phase 1 of the system. We think that having a complete funding plan for Phase 1 is critical, and that's going to be an issue that you want to consider, and to the extent that the authority is developing that plan for the rest of the system. The second issue for legislative consideration that we identified ties into the issue of funding, and this is the scope of the initial operating segment. The legislature is going to want to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed scope change. The previously planned initial operating segment would have gone from the Central Valley into the Los Angeles area and would have served a much more populous region of the state, and according to the authority's estimates, would have had a much higher level of ridership than the now proposed initial operating segment into San Jose. However, the authority would have required at least another $10 billion for the much higher capital costs of that segment, and they have not identified the funding to complete that as scheduled. And so we think that to the extent the legislature wants to continue the development of a high-speed train system, that the proposed scope change has some merit, because it is much more likely that a full funding package for the IOS north into San Jose could be achieved than the previously planned initial operating segment into the Los Angeles basin. To the extent that the legislature concurs with the scope change going into San Jose, the legislature is going to want to consider whether or not the IOS has standalone value. As I said before, under the authority's plan, building this initial operating segment would exhaust all of the identified funding sources for this project. And so it is unclear when additional funding would become available, and perhaps unlikely that it would become available on the timeline the authority is assuming to complete the remainder of Phase 1 of the project. And so to the extent that the funding does not become available, you're going to want to ensure that whatever is built, $20 to $30 billion project, that has standalone value, that has a scope that meets your priorities. And in particular, I think Mr. Richard already addressed the issue of the southern terminus. We think that there's options there, and the legislature does not need to concur with stopping the project in an agricultural area. We think that could be problematic. That's not consistent with the CEQA approval for the project. It would require additional environmental review and also would end the train in an area that does not have the services necessary to meet the needs of passengers in terms of transit connections, rental cars, parking lots, and those types of facilities. The legislature could direct the authority to have the last stop on the train system to be one stop north of that, which is a planned permanent station. You could also make it a priority to identify the $2 billion in additional funding necessary to extend the line into Bakersfield. And those are just some examples, but we think that ensuring that the scope is something that meets your priorities and makes sense is going to be an important issue for the legislature to consider. And lastly, the remaining issue that we want to highlight for you is just ensuring that the project has adequate legislative oversight. Your staff agenda notes that we have not a recommendation, but a sort of an issue to consider that the legislature needs detailed information on the cost, scope, and schedule of the high-speed rail project. Information that's provided in the business plans as well as other reports that come to the legislature can be extremely difficult to compare from one plan to another, and it makes it very challenging to track changes in cost and schedule over time because the information reported in one plan may relate to a specific scope, and as that scope changes over time, it's very difficult to understand if the cost changed as well. Is that because of a change in scope, or is it because costs have gone up or gone down? And so we think that the legislature may want to require more detailed information and specify certain scopes of work in order to ensure that information is comparable over time. We think you also would want to consider requiring future business plans to include information on all of the costs, not just capital costs. The authority, if they do finance a portion of the construction of the system, could have very high financing costs, and that's a significant factor for the legislature to consider and would require funding to pay those. And so you may want to have a more complete picture of the total cost of the project. I'll end my comments there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the detailed presentation. Let's move on to the panel discussion now, and I'll call forward, I think, Michael Turner's here from LA Metro, LAMTA, Jeff G., Redwood City Council member, and Jim Hartnett from Caltrain.
He wants to stay.
Yeah, well, no, we have 3 seats, so I think, yeah, we're good. Welcome.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Michael Turner on behalf of the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And I want to start by saying that we have long supported the high-speed rail project. We actually urged the legislature to include the connectivity funding in the original legislation that put the measure on the ballot. We're using that money now to build the regional connector, which will help link our light rail lines throughout Los Angeles County and help connect people to Union Station, which we hope ultimately is one of the key stations on the high-speed rail project. We also supported SB 1029 when it was considered, I believe, in this room a few years ago, that created the funding for the bookend investments on the project. And we considered then, and we consider that now, to be a key element in the strategy to maintain a statewide consensus on the high-speed rail project. We've been working very closely with the Office of the Secretary, the board, and with Jeff on the project ever since they've come on board, and we've had a very good working relationship with them. We think the MOU provides a good framework and a good basis for those discussions to continue, but within that there are challenges that we face. With the business plan and the change going to the north, that is a big change. We still support the project, but that's a big change. and we're going to have to work through that, and we think the MOU gives us some ability to do that. So what we have to do is look at the projects that are in that MOU. There's some updating of those. We've done a lot of work on Union Station, a lot of discussions with the High-Speed Rail Authority about the nature of the improvements there. There's been a lot of discussion about the Rosecrans-Marquardt, say it correctly, grade separation, and how those things should be addressed. So we've got a list of projects that we think provide a very solid basis for discussions, and then where we have to get to is what specific commitments do we make to those specific projects. There are key questions about the use of funds in this. There are the high-speed rail bond funds, the cap-and-trade funds. We would want to look at those first. There have been other discussions about the freight funds from the new federal legislation, as well as other categories of cap and trade. And we think there are conversations to be had there, but we would suggest that in the course of discussing the high-speed rail project, we also have to keep in mind that we have a significant freight challenge in our region, as we are home to the largest port complex. And so in addition to the grade separation project we're talking about, there are other corridors of national significance that need attention. We also have challenges with greenhouse gas emissions in our region and a very high population of our county that lives in disadvantaged communities. And when we're looking at the cap and trade funds, we need to look at the highest and best uses of those and how we use those as well. So we're encouraged that the authority has taken a very proactive approach in working with us in having these conversations. We've had good conversations thus far, and we're encouraged that as we work through the MOU, we will continue to have those conversations, but ultimately what we need to get to is specific commitments of specific funds to specific projects. And as I mentioned, our priority would be to look at the 1A and the cap and trade funds, and then we can have a conversation about the freight and the cap and trade funds and how those fit in to our overall program as well. So with that, I'll conclude and move on.
Thank you. Who's going next? Mr. G?
Yeah, okay. I think you're listed.
Well, I'm next. Okay.
You're next on my list, but
Okay.
you can go in
All right,
any order
that's
you
fine.
like.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Members of the committee, Jeff G., council member of the City of Redwood City. And just to calibrate, Redwood City is located about in the middle between San Francisco and San Jose on the peninsula. And in my other roles as an elected official, I also serve on the San Mateo County Transit District Board, the Caltrain Board of Directors, the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority Board, and chair of the Commute.org, which is San Mateo County's transportation demand management organization. Other than going to a lot of meetings, what that means also is I get to hear a lot from our constituents about the challenges of moving around the Bay and the peninsula. And the investment in Caltrain and high-speed rail is a big tool into helping our community move around the peninsula. It's a much-needed tool to move not only throughout the state of California, but from San Francisco to San Jose and south and north. And when Caltrain is complete with its modernization program, and we are just about at the shovel-ready moment later on this year, the Caltrain capacity will nearly double, which is a big, big deal for our region. My role here is to represent local government. And as some of our constituents have said, just run more trains, I find myself at a very delicate balance as being a local elected official, is that running more trains is great for the region, but that's a north-south corridor. And what that means for my east-west connectivity is more gate time. More gate time means longer cars, lines of cars waiting, more greenhouse gas emissions, particularly at my at-grade crossings near my residential neighborhoods. And so at the local government level, what we're looking for is concurrent investment in local communities to help make a difference so that we can run more trains, not have longer gate times or more gate times, longer cars of waiting, more greenhouse gas emissions, and that we can run more trains safely, more environmentally friendly, and at a local level, less impactful to our communities. The planning and design of these improvements need to be concurrent with high-speed rail and with the Caltrain modernization. And it really makes a huge difference that when we can do these things together, that our local communities can benefit from that. We have about 47 at-grade crossings throughout the peninsula segment. that many of these, if we can find ways to partner together to separate road, cars, and trains, will make a huge difference on our mobility needs in the region. They're a top priority for both Caltrain and for Samtrans. And, I can see the benefit in our city alone. Right outside of our city hall, we have the Jefferson Avenue undercrossing that was built in the 90s and commissioned in 1999. Trains and cars, north-south, Caltrain, east-west, car and trucks, they coexist peacefully without any conflict. Trains can run, and there's no backups. What we've learned when we do road diets in my city, that if we upset motorists by 30 seconds or a minute, they become very emotional and very passionate, and they let us know. And so if we are able to work together, find ways to collaborate with local government to grade separate trains and at grade crossings, we can find ways to move people better across our region. So I'm here to help advocate for that concurrent investment, not just for Redwood City, but for all of my fellow elected colleagues up and down the peninsula. Jim?
Thank you, Council Member. And so we'll wrap up now with Mr. Hartnett from Caltrain.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. It's a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity. My name is Jim Hartnett. I'm the Executive Director of the Caltrain Commuter Rail System and the CEO of the San Mateo County Transit District, as well as of the San Mateo County Transportation Association. When voters approved Prop 1A in 2008, it wasn't just about connecting the state with high-speed rail. It was about making investments in local systems to connect the systems, improve the systems to support a statewide rail network. And large-scale visionary projects such as high-speed rail are examples of projects that should and must be planned in a way that prioritize investments in local improvements while also making incremental but significant progress toward the long-term vision. And that's what the investment in the bookends accomplishes, particularly from our perspective for the northern bookend. In addition to my current positions, I served for 4 years as a member of the board of the High-Speed Rail Authority and previously served as mayor of Redwood City. So I have some direct connection to the history of high-speed rail in our region in the Bay Area. It's been a very interesting history. During the time that I was on the board of High-Speed Rail Authority, there was a transformation of the approach on the board, and it was in part prodded by a community, in part based upon an extensive reevaluation by the High-Speed Rail Authority itself in terms of what made sense. It was in collaboration with the legislature. And it was a recognition at the time of this transformation of what really made sense, not just for us on the peninsula, but statewide for high-speed rail and the connectivity to the broader statewide rail system. And so, as you know, the product of efforts by many, including many in this room, was SB 1029, which appropriated for the high-speed rail monies for construction not only in the Central Valley, but directed over $1 billion of investment in local and regional improvements in the bookends in Southern California and in Northern California. And in our case, that state funding is being used, as you know, to leverage over $1 billion. I emphasize leveraging over $1 billion in other monies to upgrade our Caltrain corridor and allow us to deliver more service at a time when our communities really, really need it most. We're happy that the draft business plan reaffirms the state the state's commitment to advancing and investing in these local improvements. For us, we're struggling to accommodate unprecedented regional growth. 2015 brought us our 5th consecutive year of record-setting ridership. As those of you who have been to our area and driven on Highway 101 between San Francisco and San Jose, or taken the beautiful 280, you find that it takes a lot longer to get where you'd like to go. And it's because of the economic dynamism and dramatic growth of our region that we have congestion that people never would have dreamed of before. And we are in a circumstance in which the demands on our rail system are incredible. At peak hours, we are already at 100% capacity, and the demand continues. The electrification is extremely important to the entire region, not just because it will potentially allow us to double the capacity of our rail system, but it will allow us to affect the congestion on the roadways as well. You know, we're in a region that is pretty extraordinary, in a state that's very extraordinary. But our region, our 51-mile railroad goes through a region that is responsible for about 14% of the state's GDP. About 20% of California tax revenue comes from our region. And we're the birthplace of over half of the patents that arise from folks who are in California. We're in a very extraordinary area in which we are served by a more than 150-year-old commuter rail service that needs to be modernized, not just to keep up with where we are now, but to take care of our future ridership demand. Fortunately, with the state's help, Caltrain has been able to advance our modernization program, our electrification program. And the centerpiece of that is to transform us from a diesel fleet to a clean electric fleet. We'll be able to deliver service that is cleaner, faster, and more frequent to those folks who live and work and come through the peninsula. When we are finished, ultimately with electrification, we will have almost doubled our capacity. We will have reduced vehicle miles driven by hundreds of thousands of miles every day. The system's greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced ultimately by almost 97%, eliminating hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2. Not to mention the jobs that are created by not only the construction but the increased ability to serve people. You know, right now we're on a pace to provide 19 million rides per year in our old system that is just strained to the nth degree. But that 19 million rides per year equates to about 380 million road miles not driven per year. 380 million road miles not driven per year based upon our current ability to serve people. We have a diesel fleet that is reaching the end of its useful life. We have to electrify just to keep up with our current service and to keep up with the demand that we know is there, because people every day are saying, we need you to stop here, we need you to stop there. We can't get on the train anymore. So we have, in our history of working with high-speed rail, we've worked together with others, and in 2012, there was the MOU between 9 parties in our region that put together the funding plan to complete these improvements. We have more work to do, but we are very pleased that in addition to the other monies that we've talked about that we bring to the table, the federal government really believes in our electrification, our modernization project. The FTA has allocated about $73 million of funds from prior fiscal years that do not require congressional action for our electrification project that we use towards matching state funds. And the President has put a $125 million line item in his proposed 2017 budget, and we know we have tremendous support for that. But meanwhile, as we continue to collaborate with the High-Speed Rail Authority as it prepares to go through the environmental process on the peninsula for additional improvements that will be needed to equip the corridor to accommodate high-speed rail service in what we call the blended system. We are still engaged in the planning and design together with high-speed rail. And as that is done, it's certainly important that as we work together, the impacts on our surrounding neighborhoods have to be minimized, and the benefits that have been promised need to be realized. We know that if done right, our 150-year-old rail corridor will be transformed, connecting the nation's most innovative communities to each other and to the rest of the state. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Hartnett. I took note of your claim to half of the patents in the state of California. I think Mr. Turner could probably claim another half. And that leaves the rest of the state with a third half. I'm not sure how that math works.
We're a great state.
We are indeed. Well, Mr. Morales, you've heard presentations about upgrades and enhancements that are desired both at both of the bookends to the project. For example, I heard Councilmember G very clearly talking about the number of grade separations that would benefit the Caltrain line, and I think there's only, if I'm reading my notes correctly here, there's only 3 currently in the planning and in the budget. So if you could, I'll kick off the questions here by asking, how do you move forward on these issues, and what is the timeline for resolving them?
Sure. 2 things about grade crossings I think it's important to keep in mind. One, there's the safety issue of grade crossings. Where you have at-grade crossings, there are safety issues, and that's true wherever they are. The second is the issue that Councilmember G was speaking to, which was more than the traffic impacts of the result of having gates down. And I do want to point out first that on the peninsula, because we will be using the existing corridor, so all of those grade crossings exist today and have for the better part of 150 years. We are working on that, but what our plan
You're
calls
going to be
for...
adding, the project's going to be adding capacity.
We will be adding
the concern
the combination,
that the
yes.
east-west traffic is going to back up even
correct.
further.
But both Caltrain capacity will be increasing, as well as the addition of high-speed rail in the corridor. But I just do want to point out first, from a safety perspective, our plan calls for significant safety upgrades to those corridors, full fencing of the corridor, quad gates, which are the state-of-the-art facilities. So the safety issue will be addressed to statistically about 99+%. So that's a very important element. On the broader question of grade separations, I think that is really a discussion that we need to and are engaging in with the region to look at how to fund those grade separation projects beyond those that are strictly needed in order for us to do our operations. Grade separation projects, particularly on the peninsula, can be very complicated because you talk about impacting adjacent. You have things built up right up to the rail line, so they're not simple projects by any means. They can be very expensive, And so one of the things that we are working on with the region, with Caltrain, is developing a regional strategy for how to move those forward beyond those that are necessary for us to operate. The other thing I would just point out is elsewhere in the state where we are building new dedicated infrastructure, so for instance through the Central Valley, we'll be eliminating 55 existing grade separations. Some of those right in downtown Fresno that have the same types of impacts on traffic and other things that will now be removed from there, and we're working on others in Southern California as well.
Let me respectfully, if I can, interrupt you. I didn't mean to, although I'm sure Councilmember G is happy about it, I didn't mean to focus you in solely on the issue of grade separations. I'm more interested in the big picture of the various issues and improvements that are of concern or interest to the communities on the two bookend sides of the project. So I'm interested in your responding to what the process will be and what length of time it will take to discuss and resolve as many of those issues as possible.
The near-term process so I'll talk first on the peninsula. We are, in fact, we have initiated an environmental process to look at those improvements that we will need to make to the corridor above and beyond the electrification project. That process is underway now and involves extensive community engagement to look at what impacts there are, including traffic impacts, and what would trigger then the need for new grade separations, then develop the strategy for how to fund those. I think that some of the issues that Mr. G is talking about probably go beyond, strictly speaking, what would come out of our environmental process and go to the functioning of the cities there, even under existing conditions. So our environmental process is underway. We're scheduled to complete at the end of 2017, so we would have by then would have a sense of what we would need to do on that corridor in order to operate in conjunction with the communities. I think the other process is the broader regional discussion, which is getting underway now.
All right, thank you. And Southern California?
And Southern California, we have the MOU in place. Well, similarly, we're going through the environmental processes there on the section. What we've been talking about between Burbank and LA and then on to Anaheim, we also have the environmental reviews with all the same community engagement there. There we have a significant number of already identified projects that in many cases there's already regional money committed to them, in part, not to fully fund them. They've recognized the priority of those. We're working with the agencies now to develop the strategy, and you'll see it in the final business plan, a clearer description of what that process will be for determining how we can jointly with the region move those projects together and get them going as soon as possible. The Rosecrans Marquardt one we spoke of, again, is in environmental reviews led by Metro. The plan then is to move that into construction as quickly as possible, hopefully this year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of questions and then a couple of comments. First, Mr. Morales, this business plan, the 2016 draft plan, shows decrease in costs, construction costs for both the San Francisco to San Jose segment and the San Jose to Merced segment. Can you give me greater detail of how we're able to project those decreases in costs?
Sure. Overall, we show about a $5.5 billion reduction of cost, just going relative to the 2014 plan, and that's a combination of three major factors. One is the first is a combination of value engineering, also better information about alignments and just advancing the project another 2 years. The second element are the lessons learned from the first bids, actually taking specific examples of things that the bidders proposed, different ways of doing things that can be applied elsewhere in the system. A specific example is our plans called for elevated structures in many locations. What the bidders came in with were places where they said, rather than doing an elevated structure, which costs more to build up, was to put embankment in and reduce costs. So we've now looked at where we can apply that same principle elsewhere in the system, and that is part of the cost reduction. And then the third is because of, and it's the smallest piece, but because of the 2 years of advancement, we've addressed some of the contingency issues, the unknowns, and so we actually do reduce the contingency slightly, just because we've eliminated some of the uncertainties along the way.
Can I just supplement, though, to say that the contingency is still very significant? I mean, it's
about 11, in the Phase 1 system, all told, there's $11 billion of contingency
out of
built
the 64.
into the number.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Richard, help me understand. Are we currently in contract to construct south to Shafter?
We're currently, Mr. Morales just executed what we call construction package 4, and basically that goes to that area just south of Shafter. So when we say currently in construction, we're currently in construction starting up in the Fresno and Madera area. We have executed the contract that will commence construction soon for, I think it's 22 miles or something like that, in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley.
Okay. And the ridership projections on the operating segment north from the Central Valley to the Silicon Valley, how confident are you of those based on the fact that we're not connecting into Bakersfield?
Right. So let me say a general comment about our ridership projections, and then specifically in that area. Well, I'll start with specifically in that area, which was your question. I don't think there's any question that as it exists right now in our draft business plan, the real ridership is going to be coming basically from Fresno to the Silicon Valley. There's not that much of an increment south of Fresno. This is a good time to maybe explain why all this comes together this way, because as I was saying before, the average citizen applying common sense would look at this and have a number of questions. We operate with a fair number of constraints, not only in the Prop 1A, but also the need to spend the federal money that we have by the deadline of 2017. Any monies from the $3.3 billion, well, it's actually from about $2.5 billion of the federal money that isn't spent by that time gets left on the table. So in the past, it was determined that the first segment would be in the Central Valley. That was the basis for the contract with the federal government. And so ultimately, of course, the tracks will run all the way through there. And we had started down that road. And then when we looked at, well, what can we do to get a system up and running fast enough, we basically said, if we keep marching south from where we're going, we could end up short on the other end and not be able to get to San Jose. That would not be a usable segment. So this portion, it's really kind of a tail track south of Hanford, but it does have an important function in helping us test the trains, because it's a long increment, allows us to test the trains. In terms of ridership, what I do want to say is that we have a high degree of confidence in our ridership projections. There have been 2 different peer review groups that have looked at our overall ridership projections. The peer review group represented by Mr. Thompson, who's testified before this committee, and a separate, and I don't want to ascribe to him a specific endorsement of the numbers, but he testified last time that our methodologies are state-of-the-art, albeit with a lot of uncertainties. There was a separate peer review group that was just focused on ridership projections, and then there was an audit of all that by the Federal Governmental Accountability Office that basically said that they looked at our methodologies for cost and revenue projections and found them to be sound and reasonable. Despite all that, Mr. Rossi, my colleague, the former banker, more or less has arbitrarily reduced some of the ridership estimates, basically by about a quarter from prior plans, just so we can have a high degree of confidence that even at those lower estimates we can still achieve the crossing the bar of operating without a subsidy.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chair, two comments then, and I'm done. First comment does have to do with the the Central Valley to San Jose segment, and I don't want to disparage the people or the almonds in Shafter, but I would hope that we don't invest a lot of money in a station there, since it's not a permanent spot, and if we're moving in that direction, I just think we've got to connect to Bakersfield and we've got to connect to Merced in that segment, and we've got to do that as soon as possible. I just think it does make sense otherwise. So I would hope that as you look at the business plan in this draft form, that some consideration be given to how do we expedite the construction all the way down to Bakersfield and then up the link up to Merced. The second comment is that I think that there's merit for the legislature and the administration and the authority to give consideration to how do we move forward with some additional investments early in the bookends. I'm concerned, obviously, in the region I represent with both safety, traffic flow, and full acceptance of the electrified Caltrain that can occur with some community investments in grade separations. In Southern California, I'm concerned about the constraints that freight traffic currently provides, and whether there are ways to address that, as well as additional grade separations in a region that where not only are we trying to move people, but we've got an awful lot of freight movement out of the port at Los Angeles and Long Beach that needs to be addressed. So I'm hopeful that we could give some consideration as a way to look at additional investments in the bookends as part of our deliberations this year.
Mr. Chairman, might I just have 15 seconds to make one
15
comment?
seconds, please.
I just wanted to say, on your first point, Assembly Member, we are already looking hard at that question of the temporary station in Shafter. Both, we agree with the LAO that is worth another look, and we've also been talking with people in Bakersfield about the best way to go forward. So we're taking that very seriously, as is the question of connecting to Merced, and I've been working directly with Assemblymember Gray, Senator Galgiani, and I've also heard from, as you would imagine, from Congressman Costa on that question. We are giving a lot of thought and effort to that, and you may see movement in the final plan.
Mr. Patterson, then Mr. Obernolte.
For the purpose of time and don't need to go back over old territory. But just briefly with respect to the LAO's analysis. Members, this is a very serious analysis. It is clear and in-depth and shows significant holes in the plan. And I really think we have to understand that, embrace it, and deal with it. So I'm not going to go over all of the concerns that were raised. But I think I heard two things here. One, you're $3 billion short of the initial segment. $2.9 billion?
Actually,
I thought I heard you testify to that.
Let me just be clear, Assembly Member. If we do not get that money, we can build a segment that operates without a subsidy and comports with the Bond Act. If we get that money, we have a better and more sensible segment. But the $3 billion is not necessary in order to have a useful segment under the definition of the Bond Act and useful for other purposes. It makes more sense to connect into Bakersfield and upgrade into San Francisco, but if we don't get that money, we will build something that comports with the Bond Act, delivers passengers without a subsidy.
Do you have a response?
I think the $2.9 billion that you're referencing is to extend the initial operating segment into Bakersfield, as well as certain upgrades to allow high-speed trains to get up the peninsula partway into San Francisco, not the full scope of San Jose to San Francisco.
Did I also hear that the terminus in Shafter could be there a decade or more? I understood that you had to get, if you got additional money, it would be through federal sources, and it would be over a long period of time.
Federal sources are the first source that we're going to seek. If that doesn't happen, we'll be looking for other sources to make that connection because it makes sense. I think that going to the question that Assemblymember Gordon asked, and also the issue that was raised by the LAO, our current draft business plan contemplated, because that was, Shafter was the end of the construction, that we would put a temporary station there. We've heard a lot of commentary from people questioning whether that makes sense, or whether the last station should be in Hanford, which is, or Wasco, which are our current stations. So we're looking at that question. If there were a temporary station, it would be there until we extend it down into Bakersfield. We have people questioning whether the temporary station makes sense, and we're reevaluating that issue.
Did I misunderstand that the time frame with respect to finding additional money could stretch a decade or more to get to Bakersfield?
Well, that is correct, Assemblymember, in the sense that we're saying that this will open in 2025, which is 9 years from now, and we would like to be able to open to Bakersfield in that same time frame.
Second point, wasn't the decision to make the turn going south to going north a tacit admission you just couldn't build going south?
I think I said before, Assemblymember, that if we look at the dollars in hand, the federal dollars, the bond money, and the cap-and-trade dollars, we estimate about a $20 billion allocation of those funds, and that does provide sufficient funding, and I think the LAO said that, if you make those other assumptions, to San Jose, and it's about $30 billion to LA. So it's simple math. We simply didn't have $30 billion, we had $20 billion, and we could get this up and running now. I wouldn't call it an admission, sir, as much as just a recognition of the math.
How do you intend to finance closing that gap? How do you get south and pay for it?
There are a number of different strategies. Let me just first say, when I first got to the High-Speed Rail Authority Board, in our first draft business plan, 6 weeks after I got here, people had put in a whole bunch of different pots of money that could be there, and I didn't really find that credible. It was also my experience from 12 years on the BART board that these things are built in segments and dollars aren't always identifiable, in fact, rarely identifiable at the beginning. And so we took a very constrained view to just talking about things that had some certainty to them. On the Senate side, on Monday, they asked us to come back in the final business plan and lay out different sources of money that could fill that gap. But for these purposes, sir, let me just say that our estimate is that the fully built-out system will generate about $20 billion of private sector concession funds. Now, not all of that will be associated with the first leg, but there will be pieces of that with the second leg. Secondly, we haven't even, what you'll see in the final business plan, based on the request from the Senate side, is we will discuss a range of potential sources of money that we really haven't delved into too much. For example, in Japan, 32% of the revenues that the private sector operator gets come from real estate development around the stations. There's new legislation from this legislature. There are other potential legislative vehicles that would allow us to harvest some of what we anticipate will be enormous development around these stations. So that's one source of money. Asset monetization. We're building 520-mile linear system. We already hear from people who want to have us lease our right-of-way for fiber optics. Further federal money, I think, could be there. But are there gaps? There are. I would just point out that the Bond Act never contemplated that this whole thing would be opened up at once. What it said was you can build it in usable segments. You have to show you have the money for each segment, and that's what we're doing. So, Assemblymember, I'm not going to pretend that we sit here today and know exactly how all the rest of this is going to be funded. That is a standard that we can't meet today. I don't think any transit agency could meet. But we have our arms around pretty big chunks of it, and we are confident that about two-thirds of it right now is identified from current or sources that are reasonably potential, and we're looking at those other sources, and we'll lay that out in further detail in the final plan.
We've heard a lot about securitization. That's a code word for debt, for borrowing. How much do you propose to borrow? What would the terms of that borrowing look like? And what kind of a payback structure? How far out does debt instruments that you may be considering go?
Well, of course, a lot of those questions will be determined by the market conditions at the time. But in the draft business plan, and I think Ms. Peters alluded to this before, there would be about $5.3 billion, I think we said, of $5.2 billion that would be proceeds from financing, and that would be tied to the longevity of the cap-and-trade program as a financing mechanism. We don't have to borrow. We can go pay as you go. And I think we talk about that in the draft plan. That just means it takes longer. And again, I think the question of debt always is balanced against the question of benefit. So we would make that decision in concert with the legislature because, as was pointed out, well, we would probably need, the market would probably require some specific legislative authorization. And so this body would have the opportunity to reflect on that balance. Yeah. And it's like anything else. You get the thing built faster, you get the benefits faster, the employment, the tax revenues, and you're carrying some debt. And so we would need to look at that. But we said we think the sensible approach is to go pay as you go up to some part in the middle of next decade and then finance the rest. And we think that's the best balance. But you and your colleagues will have a chance to reflect on that before we go forward.
Again, what I hear is that there is an anticipation that the people of California and the legislature would have to, in some way, act as a banker here.
No, a securitization, sir, means that what you're borrowing against is an anticipated revenue stream. So if that revenue stream were already created, then there's no further obligation. It's not a general obligation bond. It would be against those revenues. I'm somewhat familiar with securitizations. I've dealt with them in the past. And the bankers in those cases asked that the legislature make certain commitments that revenue stream would be available, but not for a generalized impact on the public at large.
But again, the taxpayers would have to, through this legislature, would have to approve the debt and the stream of revenue. I mean, it's a debt instrument. It is a borrowing of a lot of money.
They would have already approved it, Assemblymember. What I'm saying is, if there's a stream of revenue that is in the cap-and-trade program, even if today, let's just talk about 2020, if what we wanted to do today was to say, well, we'd like to just get that lump of money right now, we would ask the legislature for authority, and actually you've already given it to us because in 862 it said we could finance off of the cap-and-trade revenues. We could go out to a private financing source or a public financing source and say, see this revenue stream? If you believe in this revenue stream, we'd like to borrow against it now. There'd be no impact on the public. It's already a revenue stream in existence.
I took the opportunity to look through the 38-page response by Barclays Bank to you. It raises all of the similar kinds of uncertainties and concern that the LAO raises, and essentially, if you read through it, it just says that there are so many contingencies, so many uncertainties. So I guess I'm just saying my level of confidence certainly is not at your level of confidence with respect. There's a suggestion, I think, in the plan that part of the second phase, or the completion financing, would come through profits in the first segment.
That's right.
You are suggesting that the route between San Jose and Shafter will produce
Positive operating cash.
profits,
Right. Profits is a
as is normally and understandable in terms of profits after all expenses.
That is correct.
Okay. There is, we tried to look, do you know of any high-speed rail operations in the world that make substantial profit?
Actually, all of them, virtually all of them, make an operating profit, which means that once the capital is expended, that they operate without any further subsidy and they throw off excess cash. A couple of them actually throw off enough excess cash to pay back some of their capital cost. We're not suggesting, although we kind of think we might get there, but we're not suggesting that's the case. Because of that fact, sir, that is why the authors of the Bond Act put in the requirement that there would be no operating subsidy, because they didn't think there needed to be, because they looked at the experience around the world. And I would also, finally, on this point, just observe, the closest thing we have to high-speed rail in the United States right now is the Acela service between Washington and Boston. That service, on its best day, maybe gets to 135 miles an hour. The track is terrible. They need to upgrade it. That service throws off excess cash that subsidizes other Amtrak operations. That's the closest thing we have today. It is not a true high-speed rail system. But around the world, once the capital is expended, these systems generate positive operating cash flows. And our business plan lays out the operating costs and the revenues and shows that there is positive net revenue, what you would call profit, even from this segment. That's why we're saying we can build it.
Yeah. The best I could find was Osaka and Tokyo, and they, I guess, break even through a little bit of what you define as profit. And I think the other one is the one from Paris to Lyon. But I do think it is a stretch to suggest that this segment's going to throw off profit. One final, I know that we're getting concerned about time. Your plan says that a round-trip ticket from Fresno to Silicon Valley is going to be about $126. It's $63 one way. The suggestion that we're going to load that train up with people who are going to go to Silicon Valley 5 days a week to work, my calculator said that's $32,760. I'm not convinced that's a... I mean, how deep are you going to have to subsidize a ticket to make it reasonably and affordable for people who are trying to buy an inexpensive home in the valley and get to a high-paying job in Northern California at $32,000 a year?
Well, there's 2 points on this. First of all, the ridership and revenue model is based on sort of average numbers. A private sector operator will come in and do the same thing that they do with airlines, which is they will bring their own revenue optimization to this, which means that some people will be able to get discounted tickets for advanced purchases, for block purchases, for things like that. And so the actual cost for people will depend on the conditions in the private sector operator trying to make a profit at that point. The other thing is, we were just down in Silicon Valley. They made it very clear to us that a number of those companies provide transit support today, for their workers. This would, I think, be something that we would anticipate to see. It would not be a subsidy from us, but it's not to say that the private sector couldn't help subsidize, as they do today, some of their workers to make those economics work.
I appreciate the time. I remain unconvinced, but I appreciate your answer.
We have you in the potential supporter column, Assembly. Thank you, sir.
I appreciate your eternal optimism.
The only way to get
Mr. Obernolte.
only way to get something built, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be extremely brief, I promise. So the biggest concern that I've had with the shift in operating segment to to north instead of south is the concern that Mr. Patterson just expressed, that we didn't have a clear funding plan to complete Phase 1 of the project. And if we don't complete Phase 1, that southern route, then that turns the project into a regional transit project instead of the statewide project that we promised the voters when we passed Prop 1A. So I was concerned that the draft business plan did not have a funding plan for completion of that, but what I heard you say was that the final business plan will have a funding plan for completion of the entire Phase 1. Is that correct?
It is with one caveat, Assembly Member, which is what we were asked is to identify sources that could flesh out a full funding plan. I don't think it will have necessarily the specificity, but it will talk about a basket of potential funding sources that we believe could help complete Phase 1. I don't want to make it more majestic than perhaps it'll be at this point, because there's still going to be significant uncertainties. But we will address the issue that was raised on the Senate side and by LAO to come back and talk about what are the broad outlines of how we could complete the funding for the entire Phase 1.
Okay. Well, I don't think we're looking for majestic, but I think what would suffice is a variety of contingencies. So, for example, this is one way we could make it work, or if this funding source doesn't come through, this is one way we could make it work. In other words, just something that gives us some confidence that we will indeed be able to finish the entire plan, because my fear is that we're just talking about a regional transit project at this point, and that's not going to be something that that the voters are going to be okay with.
Or that we're going to be okay with.
All right.
But we understand, sir, and that's what we will do.
And then just briefly, a second concern that I have is that we have made substantial, perhaps not legal commitments, but essentially moral commitments to the bookending projects that we've talked about in Southern California. And I think it's extremely important that we follow through on those commitments and attach real dollars to those projects. And I think that that would go a long ways towards alleviating some of the objections that people have to shifting that initial operating segment. And so I trust that you're going to work with our regional transit agencies in Southern California to make that happen.
We are committing to you and your colleagues, sir, that is exactly what we're doing. And let me also note that Secretary Kelly has been very instrumental in those, because some of those sources of money from the state he can help organize as well. But we are very committed morally and we believe legally to accomplish what was in the MOU in Southern California as well as Northern California.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that, and if we can attach real dollars to those commitments, it would be much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for your testimony here this morning. Thank you all for your questions. We will now proceed on, if I can ask you all to vacate your seats, because we do have 5 people stepping up for the public comment, the Issue 4 segment of our hearing here this morning. And so I'd like to call forward David DePinto from Save Angeles Forest for Everyone, Frank Oliveira, Citizens for California High-Speed Rail Accountability, Mike Brady of the Community Coalition, David Schoenbrunn, Train Riders Association of California, and William Grindley.
What is it? What is the
As you're situating yourselves, we're running a little bit late in our hearing. We have a second panel that will follow this one. We'll try to move as crisply as possible through both of them, and for those of you who are here to give additional public comment, I don't know how many folks there are here who will be asking to speak at the end of the meeting. I'll stay as long as we need to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to provide their testimony. I don't have the issue fortunately in this hearing that we did in the last one. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. There's an order that's provided in the agenda, but you're welcome to go in any order that you see fit.
We'll be going this direction.
Got it. L shape.
Thank you.
Mr. DePinto, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Bloom. Good morning, committee members. I'm Dave DePinto. I'm with the SAFE Coalition, president of one of the largest homeowner associations in the city of Los Angeles, in the northeast San Fernando Valley. I'll start with our answer to the fundamental question of whether the project warrants additional oversight. Yes, it needs oversight for budgets, timelines, public outreach, and environmental integrity. Oversight is needed relative to adherence and in the integrity of the NEPA, CEQA, and the authority's own SAA report process. Remember the adage, a lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. We believe present oversight lacks the bandwidth and resources to keep tabs on what's now a $21 billion organization. We ask Northern Californians to pay attention. Without greater oversight, here's what happened to us, and here's what you can expect. You'll read about routes and route changes in the mail. We just heard about enormous development from Mr. Richard in station communities. Many of us don't seek that. You'll receive permit to enter letters on Christmas Eve. We're getting them right now in our communities again with no advance notice. You'll receive no response to your comment letters and testimony at public hearings. You'll not be allowed to speak at authority-sponsored outreach meetings. You'll experience filibusters at public meetings by authority spokespersons. You'll be patronized by false optimistic timelines for environmental studies. And there'll be a lack of information and confusion regarding route alternative decisions. The only communication we've had from the authority since the June 2015 board meeting was a notice that all community outreach for the balance of 2015 had been canceled, and it hasn't continued into 2016 either. 3 weeks ago at a San Fernando Valley COG meeting, the authority announced new route changes. Yet even with a board meeting scheduled next week in Anaheim, the SAA report explaining those route changes is not public information. That report will lack the input as a result from the public and elected officials who unanimously oppose what we refer to as the above-ground routes. I'll wager $21 billion that the authority will approve or take no action on that SAA report and let staff move forward unchecked. The case study that I will share with you is the obvious conflict of interest created by the authority by engaging the Mineta Transportation Institute to conduct an equine study. This is not an indictment of Mineta. This is a mistake made by the High-Speed Rail Authority that they will not admit and they will not undo. This study is now part of the NEPA, CEQA, and SAA processes and is being used to unfairly justify the route that Frank is going to just give you a quick look at. This is the Big Tonga Wash, which connects the San Gabriel Mountains with the San Fernando Valley and the Los Angeles River. It includes the Tujunga Ponds Mitigation Area, Haynes Canyon Creek, LA's drinking water, hundreds of multi-purpose trails, wildlife, and the endangered Santa Ana suckerfish. It's no place for a viaduct, 5 to 10 years of damaging construction, or 5 more years of environmental study. It's a showstopper. It's a fatal flaw. Assemblyman Bloom, our Big Tonga Wash, as we talked about, is our Santa Monica Bay. Assemblyman Gordon, the Big Tonga Wash, is our Pescadero State Beach, the Palo Alto Baylands Preserve, and Tomcat Ranch. Assemblyman Obernolte, can you imagine this at Big Bear Lake or the Mojave National Preserve? Assemblyman Patterson, this area is on a par with your beautiful Sierra National Forest. The Mineta Equine Study is mere desktop research, no field research. It's already been rejected by the Los Angeles Equine Advisory Committee, several veterinarians with equine expertise, and our own 11-page critique, a copy of which I will submit. This study and several others were supposed to have been developed collaboratively and independently. The board voted unanimously to do that at their June 2015 board meeting. Dan Richard promised ongoing updates, in particular on their website. They failed to do this. Upset as we were, on December 3rd of 2015, we realized we had a bigger problem. We identified at least 4 Mineta Board of Trustee members with conflicts of interest with the High-Speed Rail Authority. These include the current authority CEO, 2 highly paid contractors, and a former authority chairman and board member. Our equine community never had a chance. The Mineta study is a biased, incomplete, and erroneous study being used to justify the route you just looked at within the environmental review process. We don't think this is the way to conduct business, particularly by the state of California. Have you ever seen a greater outcry in the state of California against a project for more oversight? Members, we suggest you focus very carefully, not on whether to increase oversight, but by how much and with what specific metrics and measurable guidelines. The authority should not receive special treatment and social promotion like a favored child. An overhaul may be more appropriate. If environmental oversight is not your immediate and specific purview, committee members, despite the nexus that these protracted studies have with your costs, please enlist the oversight capabilities of the appropriate committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Frank Oliveris, Citizens for California High-Speed Rail Accountability. Since the project's 2012 business plan, 4 years have passed, and the authority has steadfastly proclaimed to the legislature, local governments, and the media, as well as the public, that they were building the initial operating section south, Merced to L.A. The authority assured everyone that building the iOS South first was both financially and technically possible and absolutely critical to connect the Central Valley to Los Angeles and bridge the passenger rail gap between northern and southern regions of the state. Based on this premise, the authority justified their actions before you, the legislature, media, public, and dozens of times to secure funding through cap and trade. Just a year ago, the authority orchestrated a celebration in Fresno where they declared that the construction of the high-speed rail system between Merced and L.A. had begun. Passionate speeches were delivered. Some of you were there and applauded when the iOS South was declared to be transformative and to the state and the public. So what happened? You and I were misled. No matter how much cap and trade money is channeled into this greenhouse gas generating project, it will not be enough for the project to survive. Cap and trade funding is supposed to be used to reduce greenhouse gas by 2020, not create more greenhouse gas and pollution for decades to come, as this project will do. The reality is in 2020, you will be solicited to extend cap and trade laws indefinitely so that the gross polluter can be funded for decades to come on assurances by the authority that this will be a green project maybe someday. The draft business plan relies on you executing the legislative action that will deprive worthy projects of needed funding that will actually affect the climate in a positive manner. Without this legislation, the project does not work. Assuming that you, the legislature, do propel the future legislation that provides the authority with more cap and trade funding indefinitely, the project still never connects San Francisco to L.A., which is phase one, because of its lack of financial viability or funding identified in the draft business plan. There is no financial plan identified to extend the project from that north of Shafter to reach L.A. For 8 years, phase one has been the project mission. It is also the primary mission reflected in Proposition 1A and AB 3034. The draft business plan does not provide a realistic path forward. The draft business plan also omits the cost of the project for the entire 800-mile project. The authority is required by law to forecast the cost of Phase 2, the 800-mile project, in its business plan, but never has, and it will not until you demand that they do so. So I ask you, does the authority have to comply with the law? We've heard today, and I've heard in a Senate Transportation Committee and an Assembly Transportation Committee, the chairman of the High-Speed Rail Authority say that they don't have enough money to build Phase 1, that it will come from somewhere. If he says that they don't know where the money will come from, maybe you should pay attention. There is no source of more money. The authority does not have the financial ability to build anything beyond 100 miles or so. There is not enough money available to put a functional high-speed train on what they are building. There are no ridership studies that we are aware of that have been done on the demand of travel between San Jose and Shafter. The authority has recklessly entered into billion-dollar construction contracts already, despite not even knowing what direction the project was going. The authority does not have a planning process with technical capacity to properly assess the technical issues involved with mountain crossings and other complicated issues. At the end of the day, the construction contracts were signed and the construction started. The authority is now changing the entire direction of the project because of cost and complications. Clearly, the authority in 2012 and 2014 business plans misled us all. Not to worry, the authority has things handled. Remember, the authority was sitting in front of your subcommittee defending doing the iOS South as the right priority a mere 2 months ago, and the mountains were very doable back then. I guess they were misleading you and I on that day. I have 5 documents to submit to you which have more detail. Failing to properly oversee the high-speed rail authority will not make problems go away, lead to a successful high-speed rail system being built. Continuing to pour public dollars into an authority that has misled all of us will not lead to a successful project. Unfortunately, only changing the authority's management team and the board that oversees the project will change its culture of deceit, waste, and mismanagement and lead to a successful project someday. Do something about it. Everybody in the state is waiting for you to act. Do you have the courage to do the right thing today? If you have any questions, I'm willing to communicate with you.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Credibility and oversight go together. This morning, there's some new information that has come out which reflects the importance of additional oversight, both from Mr. Richard and from the representatives of Caltrain. Now, you heard Mr. Richard say this morning that the reason they chose iOS North is, they have limited funds. They only have $20 billion. And $20 billion is less than what they estimated 3.5 years ago it would cost to go south, $31 billion. Now, that $31 billion is 3.5 years old. What would it be today? Would it mean that their gap is even greater? But what you weren't told this morning, and what came out 6 months ago, is that you have to add another $10 billion to the $10 billion gap between 20 and 31. That's because of a scandal that was uncovered by on the part of the High-Speed Rail Authority by the Los Angeles Times and a whistleblower in October of last year. And it goes back to the fall of 2013, when the authority was concerned about the difficulty and the cost of going under and over the San Gabriel Mountains and the Tehachapi Mountains. So they went to their eminent contractor, one of the largest in the United States, Parsons Brinckerhoff, and asked them to study it. Well, Parsons Brinckerhoff did study it. And the High-Speed Rail Authority held on to the report and kept it secret for 25 months. Why did they keep it secret? Because their own contractor said, you have to add $9 billion more to your $31 billion. Because the confluence of earthquake faults under those mountain ranges are the greatest in the world. The confluence of these faults, making it incredibly difficult to go through or under this region. They kept that secret. The whistleblower went to the LA Times. The LA Times wrote an article in October of 2015. What happened then? Congress descended on them. The Assembly, some of the people in the Assembly descended on them, and the court proceedings descended on them, until they were so embarrassed they finally revealed it days later after all this pressure was put, and it comes out. $9 billion. Now, where do you see that in the business plan? And where have you heard that today? Oversight and credibility are central to this issue. Now, I also want to commend to you to read a statute that you passed long ago. Public Utilities Code 185033. 185033. As I read this, it says every time the authority gives a report to the legislature, And we've had the business plan of 2014, we have the business plan of 2016, and many other reports, including one today. They are supposed to tell you an updated cost of the entire statewide system and every segment of it, the entire statewide system. Now, is there anything that any legislature in the United States wants to know more? Updated cost of projects that they are funding. That's good oversight. It makes a lot of sense. They have never complied with that provision since Proposition 1A was passed. Are the people who live in San Diego, the Inland Empire, Sacramento, and Oakland potted plants? They did vote for this project. They're completely ignored. Nobody knows what Phase 2 is going to cost because they've never complied with that Public Utilities Code section. Make them comply. The voters of this state need to know what the entire statewide system is going to cost. They just pay attention to Phase 1, pretending like Phase 1 is everything. Now, I'd like to make a couple of comments about what Caltrain said. What they have not told you is that the original cost of electrification, when the legislature appropriated the money, was $1.2 billion. They haven't told you that that's almost doubled. Oh, no, it's almost doubled. Actually, the $600 million was appropriated by the legislature for the peninsula under the anticipation that the whole thing would cost $1.2. But if it's going to cost $2 billion, it means you've got to go back and appropriate more money, if that's even legal. Did you also know that when you appropriated $600 million for the peninsula and $500 million for Southern California, the bookends, did you know that they had not given you a funding plan? That is not a legal appropriation. There's no problem with the Central Valley. The Central Valley, they gave you a funding plan, the authority, and you appropriated the money. But the bookends were an afterthought, and they never presented you with a legal funding plan. You have to have a legal funding plan. That appropriation cannot be considered. It's not even legal because there was no legal funding plan as required by Proposition 1A. So that's very important to realize. You're also told these glowing stories about cooperation from Southern California. Do you know that your own legislative council said the Southern California operation is illegal under Proposition 1A because they won't electrify. They refuse to electrify. They can't get any Proposition 1A money. They can't even get the $500 million you supposedly appropriated for them. That is not revealed. Another instance where you need oversight. A few months ago, the High-Speed Rail hearing, the High-Speed Rail Authority held hearings on the peninsula about their grand plans for Caltrain. There was virtually an uprising, and here's why. There are 47 intersections between San Francisco and San Jose. They all have to be grade separated. That's about $5 billion conservatively. They don't have any money for that. They have no money. And listen to this. Proposition 1A requires that 12 trains going north and 12 trains going south be accommodated by the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco. That means that coming down the peninsula, there will be 12 trains going south, 12 trains going north. Every intersection and every city will be paralyzed without grade separation. They don't have the money for you don't hear this addressed. You don't hear it addressed at all. They don't have the money for it. It's going to result in paralysis. So these are a few instances why you desperately need oversight and why these unanswered questions need to be examined. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm David Schoenbrunn. I'm wearing 3 hats today. I'm Vice President for Policy of the Train Riders Association of California. I'm the President of TransDef, a nonprofit that's currently litigating the eligibility of high-speed rail to receive cap-and-trade funding. We're seeking to have the court shut off the flow of cap-and-trade funds to high-speed rail. And I'm a member of the legal team that fought the lawsuits that were recently before the court in Sacramento. so I have 12 years of deep experience with high-speed rail. On the surface, the draft business plan is a nice, inspiring document. Under the surface, however, there are many problems with the claim that the authority can pull together nearly $21 billion to build the new IOS. First, even though the legislature appropriated bond funding for the bookends, that money cannot be spent on construction. No one seemed to notice that the legislature can't just give away bond funds. The promise of dollars given to Southern California was a bad check. There has to be a valid funding plan, not just one before the appropriation, but one after the appropriation that shows that the project is fully funded so as to be high-speed rail ready. They're $44 billion short on that, and so that means this great very generous gift to Southern California can't actually be used, and the same is true for Caltrain. I don't believe that, number two, I don't believe they'll ever qualify for the release of bond funds for Central Valley construction. This plan is not a credible demonstration of the full funding of the IOS. Without full funding, no money for construction. I also have grave doubts about how many riders will be attracted to a 1-hour high-speed rail trip to then get on a bus to Los Angeles. And my colleague spoke about the unlikelihood of commuting at $63 a trip, one way. They have to, three, they need special legislation to allow them to finance cap and trade. I think the legislature would be fiscally irresponsible to throw this project that kind of lifeline when it has no realistic way forward to the full phase one. 4, cap and trade revenues from 2025 to 2050 are very speculative. The high risk will produce much smaller proceeds than they need. 5, we are suing to prevent cap and trade from going to high-speed rail. We have evidence that the project will increase greenhouse gases rather than reduce them. A win in court would shut down the project by cutting off its funding. 6, it makes no sense to use the GHG reduction fund to build something that won't reduce GHGs for a long time to come. The urgent need for emissions reduction is now, when it really counts, and not in 20 years. 7, they're dreaming if they seriously think the feds will pony up more money. And 8, where does all the money come from for the rest of phase one? It certainly isn't from the monetizing of cash flows. This problem is the inevitable result of decisions that go all the way back to the early days of the authority. The new business plan talks a lot about bringing in the private sector early in the design process. That's also what the peer review group recommended, but that's not what was done. The private sector was not brought in for the most critical part of the design, selecting the route. The reason there is no private money in this project now is because the route is a money loser. No one from industry says that out loud because it would be impolitic. Without the enthusiastic involvement of private capital, there can't be a realistic plan to build an entire system. High-speed rail in California can be a viable money-making business. I'm a transit advocate. I'm a high-speed rail advocate. I'm profoundly opposed to this specific project. The thing is, this is not a money-making business when the route came out of political deal-making rather than designed by private transportation-oriented companies. Various rail operators are convinced that Los Angeles to San Francisco is a moneymaker if done right. I personally was present at the dress rehearsal of a presentation by a rail operator that was willing to build the entire Los Angeles to San Francisco system and had an investment banker ready to go. Their one condition was that they picked the route. They were turned down flat. The fact that you've never heard this discussed publicly says a lot about motivations. The authority has pretty much admitted in this draft plan that they have no way to build to Southern California. This plan is the early warning signal that Chairman Richards spoke about. It's time to hit the brakes, because this project is heading for the cliff with a huge accompanying waste of taxpayer dollars. The Bay Bridge will appear tiny in comparison. Your responsibility to your constituents is to ensure that a high-speed rail system is delivered. They cannot assure you of that and don't even have a credible way of framing it at this time. Therefore, you should look to cut the funding, shut down the project, and ask the private sector to come forward with proposals on what they would like to build. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Grinley.
Thank you. Excuse me. My name is William Grinley. I come from Silicon Valley, and for full disclosure, I'm a 52-year card-carrying, bleeding heart, knee-jerk liberal. All right? But this project is badly conceived, badly managed, and will be a disaster. My colleague Bill Warren and I have spent the last 6 years, we've written 42 publicly available reports, and a lot more that aren't, on why the finances don't work. This is my 10th time in front of the legislature, my 61st trip to Sacramento. I will take my 9th trip to Washington in a month. Our former senator from absent Richard Gordon's district, Joe Samitian, often said, "Mr. Grinley, get to the point and state your thesis." So here's my thesis. The authority continues to ignore facts about ridership, fares, costs in operating existing high-speed rail systems. It moves the goalpost on legal issues, lives in a fantasy land about private investment, uses illegal in the United States accounting to portray its train as profitable, and depends on political support from downstairs to continue. Before you are 6 observations in a paper of some 14 pages, plus one. The first documents that these guys aren't building a high-speed rail system, they're building a dirt mound because the terms shifted. They moved the goalpost. In 2014, after claiming there would be we'll build it and a concessionaire coming, they suddenly said, oh, the private sector is going to bring along investments in tracks, electrification, and signaling systems. Specifically now, in 2016, they say they want a design, build, finance, and maintain contracts. Catch the last two, finance and maintain contracts. Not, as Mr. Morales said, design and build. Design, build, finance. But they want that up front before any ridership is proven. So that's a bit of a scam going on there for the initial. The second paper documents that the authority uses an accounting system that the European Union uses for its total rail systems. But that accounting system is not allowed in the United States. European Directive 91/440 said you separate the issue of who owns the fixed infrastructure from who owns and operates the rolling stock. Well, in Europe, that means the other government agency, because all the operators are government also, takes all the cost of maintaining the track's electrical system and signaling into a second pot. The third pot in most of the European countries are their health care systems. The fourth part are their pension systems. So they operate with 4 parts. Unfortunately for the authority, it all has to go into one pot here, and DOT requires such a thing. The third paper says to you that they have very carefully, with their wording over the last 3 plans, moved from recognizing AB 3034, Section 2704, subsection 8J's demand that they not need an operating subsidy, to putting that up is a lofty goal. So they're setting you up to take that fall. The fourth paper shows that the authority's computer modelers don't really know what is reality or what the authority surveys. They have never had a survey, particularly related to the present plan, that ask potential riders, what would you do riding a system which dropped you off in Bakersfield or dropped you off somewhere other than the downtown to downtown? They've never done that. So they make up their ridership numbers. The fifth paper addresses the issue that's already been addressed, which is a $63 one-way fare between Silicon Valley and San Jose. And the sixth paper in there, thank you, David. The sixth paper asks a very interesting question. A week or so ago, I'm presently 122 pages into a critique of their plan. I asked myself, where is Oakland? Because the legislation says, and I can quote it for you, or you don't want it, the high-speed system, rail train system to be constructed pursuant to this chapter shall be designed to achieve the following characteristics. Oakland to Los Angeles Union Station in 2 hours and 40 minutes. There is no mention of Oakland in the 2016 plan or the 2014 plan. So, let me get in closing. I once again ask you, please stop this Frankenstein. Nero downstairs may be looking for a legacy, right? But you can't kick the can down this road. You're going to take the rap while he fiddles. 3 senators, all of whom had been chairs of the Transportation Committee, voted against this project in 2012. Senator Simitian said, this is the wrong project in the wrong place at the wrong time. Get brave. Don't let the puppeteer pull your strings anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all for your presentations. Mr. Patterson, any questions?
May I have one more minute? Mr. Richard talked about profitability in Acela. On the back of my handout, you will find this column chart, which we presented to Mr. Morales, Mr. Richard, and Mr. Rossi in November 2011. Yeah, you can be profitable. Acela is profitable. Acela charges 3 times per passenger mile what the High-Speed Rail Authority says it's going to charge. That's a pretty big difference. I can be very profitable if I'm Gucci and can charge 3 times the price of a good handbag.
All right, thank you. Mr. Patterson, questions? All right, great. Thank you very much for your presentations. We'll move on to the second panel and ask that those folks step forward. Thank you.
Are we going now?
We have Paul Kachadurian from Catch Environmental, Cesar Diaz, the State Building Trades, Keith Dunn from the California Association of High-Speed Trains, Paul Dyson of the Rail Passenger Association of California and Nevada, and Leanne Eager, Fresno County Economic Development Commission. Welcome to all of you, and just like with the last panel, choose your own order.
Well, it looks like I got the driver's pole position here. So, Keith Dunn, Association of California High-Speed Trains. I will be extremely brief. We've had a lot of information presented today by both the authority as well as the opposition. I just want to really talk for a moment, and I'm going to let Mr. Diaz, my colleague, talk a little bit more about the jobs. But this program has been going on for some time. In the Central Valley, we, Association for California High-Speed Trains, represents the contractors, design professionals, and others working to build and construct this project. It's creating opportunities in the Central Valley, which has been economically depressed. It's really doing a lot to move good quality, high-paying jobs for Californians as well as delivering the environmental benefits that this program has promised. Moving towards, the closer we get to construction and running trains, we're going to see more and more of those environmental benefits. It is a challenge. I think that we're all aware of that. What we can say is that it's making a real difference in the valley. If you haven't had a time, I know Mr. Patterson obviously lives there, has been able to see some of that construction taking place. We're excited to build it. We're looking forward to continue to work with this body and others in this legislature to make sure we're doing it right, because it is important that we get it right. But we feel like we're on a good path. We're looking forward to continuing in the construction process and providing good quality jobs for Californians and their families. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members, Cesar Diaz on behalf of the State Building and Construction Trades Council. As Mr. Dunn pointed out, we're also very excited about this project. A lot of our members are actually working for these contractors. The economic benefit to the Central Valley is already being felt. There's various newspaper reports about the build-out the downtown Fresno is planning, and the revitalization of their downtown. A lot of that's going to be vertical construction, and you're talking about access to the stations and actually moving people back and forth. As the conversations happen on affordable housing here in this legislature, transportation and efficient modes of actually moving people from one place to another is critical in that conversation, particularly because if you look at the Bay Area and the impact of the income inequality has there might be an opportunity to address housing there, but there's even a greater opportunity to move people from the areas that are high growth, that are perhaps more economically feasible for working families, and to be able to get them to those economic power centers, right? So if you talk about moving people from the Central Valley, where they can actually buy a home and live in actual good quality communities, and then have the ability to actually get on a train and get to work within half an hour, not only having the environmental benefit, but also being able to go back and forth, and where their actual dollars can be stretched a little bit more. So we believe that's a critical piece of incorporating that. And with regards to the jobs, if you look at the plans that they have available now, they're talking about 20,000 jobs for the next 5 years and each year. And we're talking about areas that have seen unemployment levels to double digits, and they're still suffering from high levels of unemployment. The best ability to provide economic development for those areas, one of the best options is construction. Construction has a whole variety, not just in wages, but for contractors, and also the associated businesses and economic benefits that are associated with that, from the material suppliers all the way to the hotel chains and to the restaurants. We believe that this project has a lot of accountability, a lot of oversight. We disagree with the opponents' perception about this project. We believe the legislature has put in a lot of these controls, and we basically will continue to support the project as it moves forward, because the state of California needs it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Paul Dyson. I'm the president of the Rail Passengers Association of California, which is an all-volunteer 501c3 group supported by our members' dues. I've been in this country since 1980. Our group was actually formed in 1977, and we've consistently campaigned for a statewide passenger rail system using the appropriate technology, whether it's for intercity, regional, or local transit. And these systems should in turn be integrated with bus, ride-sharing, bicycles and pedestrian access to provide convenient door-to-door journeys. As a point of information, I'm also a resident of the city of Burbank, which has been mentioned a number of times this morning, and I have served and continue to serve as chair of that city's Transportation Commission for a number of years. RailPAC's always viewed the high-speed rail project as part of a statewide system serving multiple cities and an even greater number of origin and destination pairs. So while LA-San Francisco is important, it's certainly not the only reason to build a high-speed, grade-separated right-of-way for intercity and fast regional trains. Until Proposition 1A, California when it pursued anything at all, it pursued a policy of incremental upgrades to existing rail lines. And in those 35 years that I've been involved in that process, I'd say optimistically, we've maybe made 10 years progress. For example, in spite of more frequent trains, rail journeys between Los Angeles and San Diego are no faster than they were in 1971. A number of key rail links, like Palmdale to the San Fernando Valley, the Altamont line between Stockton and San Jose, the line from Bakersfield to Mojave, these are obsolete. they're obsolete for modern passenger rail service. The routes were laid down 100 years ago where avoiding cost was far more important than journey times. So while passenger services operate over some of these routes, they only are competitive because of highway congestion and heavy subsidy. And in fact, what's extraordinary is it shows how robust demand is for passenger rail, that people will still use these extremely slow services. So if we want to take passenger rail seriously, we have to have new rights-of-way, which will enable competitive journey times. And that sentence is the important one. If we are to take passenger rail seriously. We passed a proposition 8 years ago which seemed to indicate that we are taking it seriously. A lot of people seem to be backing off now. I think everybody wanted to be at the top of Mount Everest having their photo taken, but we're just leaving the first base camp and it's starting to get a bit arduous and some people are backing away. But I still think we need to get to the top of the mountain. Since 2008, progress has been slow and mistakes have been made, especially in the speed of property acquisition and in money spent studying high-speed routes into urban centers which could never have been politically acceptable. So here we are in 2016 with a business plan that I believe is finally based in reality. Intercity trains will share rights-of-way and in some cases tracks with regional services into the city centers as they do in Europe. In the south, LA Union Station will eventually be finally be modernized to enable efficient through working. The core route from Burbank to the south end of Orange County will be modernized and grade separated, an extremely important safety consideration for existing as well as future services. And in the north, San Francisco will have its electrification and its new station. Most importantly, the construction plans for the next 5 years are realistically based on the known funds available. Obviously, huge gaps remain. We had always envisioned actually that there would be a northern regional service and a southern regional service. That would happen first before the link was built between the two. And those northern and southern services would in fact stand alone and be of significant regional benefit, whether or not the final gap was bridged. The idea of a temporary terminus did not go down well in Burbank, and so the old business plan, which had a temporary terminus 10 miles short of the hub at Union Station, just didn't make any sense. We've seen a temporary terminus of the 710 freeway in Alhambra for over 50 years, and we didn't want to get into that game. Thank you very much. We do need to find money to bridge those final gaps between up to Merced and into Bakersfield, and that shouldn't be too difficult. So obviously the real challenge is the mountain crossing. I believe it is likely to be accomplished as a toll railroad with predominantly private capital. It won't be easy, it won't be inexpensive, but experience around the globe indicates that it can be done and that it should be done. These upgrades in Southern California, as an example, again, high-speed rail improvement is all about linking multiple stations. I travel from Burbank down to Orange County, and that train ride will be 30 minutes shorter with the upgrades that are proposed in this business plan. What is the alternative? You know, we've just spent over $1 billion on upgrading the 405 freeway through the Sepulveda Pass, and the metro engineers tell us that it hasn't improved journey times through there at all. We're spending another $1 billion putting in carpool lanes through Burbank, and we're enduring years of construction and closed bridges while those carpool lanes are installed. Will they improve anything? Are we looking forward to wonderful fluidity in our traffic down there? Of course we're not. The additional lanes will just fill up with traffic. So we can choose. We can have an electric railroad for fast intercity and regional passenger rail linked to transit and local buses, or we can keep adding freeway lanes and building more airports. Come on down to Burbank and talk about building more airports or expanding the runways down there. You'll be extremely popular. So that's the choice. That's the choice, Mr. Chairman, and so it seems to me, yes, warts and all, and there are plenty of warts on this project. Nobody said it was going to be easy or clean, but I personally believe, and I think the majority of Californians still believe, that this is something with which we should continue. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for the analogy to climbing Mount Everest. As the father of somebody who's taken the trek to base camp, I can tell you from his experience that might not be quite as arduous as the remainder of the trip to the peak, but that's quite a journey, and so maybe it's an apt comparison for both phases of this project. Please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Paul Ketchadorian. I'm the owner of Catch Environmental. I'm from Fresno. I was born in Fresno, and outside of military service, I've lived there a majority of my life. I am representing one of the 276 small businesses that have been positively affected by the California high-speed rail. Prior to knowing that it was coming to Fresno, I voted for it. I've always been a supporter of high-speed rail. I think it's something that we're going to need in the future. As far as Fresno goes, coming from Fresno and living there all my life again, it's always seemed like the Bay Area, no offense to anybody from Bay Area or LA, but there was a lot of money that went to those areas, and the city of Fresno and the Central Valley in general was left out. And it's amazing to me, and it always will be, that it started in Fresno. I can see why, but it's such pride that the first high-speed rail in the United States started in my hometown. Now, what it's been able to do for Fresno is you could just see other areas and businesses that are outside, private sector businesses that are being revitalized also around this, the proposed station, and you could just see the mood of Fresno is just positive, upbeat, and the economy is just generating a lot of new jobs. Now, what it's done for my company, we do the hazardous material remediation and demolition. And prior to the high-speed rail, we had about 8 employees, and we were moving along, and it was small, very small company, and it has allowed us to hire new employees. Right now, we currently have 25 with a need for 10 more, immediate need for 10 more. And we are hiring them through the EDC, in partnership with the EDC, and hiring primarily people who are on CalWorks. And those people who are just looking for an opportunity to have a good paying job, union job with benefits, job security. This has given me the opportunity to give them the opportunity for that job. The EDC and myself, we train them and put them in a position for long-term employment. You can see these men and women that come to my company, their outlook is totally different. They're very happy that they've had the opportunity, and they really work hard. It was just the opportunity that was given to me was something that I needed, a shot in the arm, so to speak, and I gave them the same shot in the arm, and they're just working out wonderful. I am a certified small business and disabled veteran-owned business. I got out of the military disabled, and in the state of California, they try to hire small businesses and disabled veteran-owned businesses. But with the California High-Speed Rail Community Benefits Agreement, it's really put the emphasis on hiring and looking for local businesses, small businesses, disabled, women-owned businesses, things like that. It's allowed or afforded the companies, big global companies or national companies, to look at companies like mine and to give us a shot where we might have been passed on for our small size and experience in the past. This has really given them, the necessity to look towards us and to help out the local economy, and they have. So far with Construction Package 1 and Construction Package 2-3, I can tell you that there's been a lot of job creation and a lot of people that I know that are involved in the high-speed rail, and it's been nothing but positive. Some of the buildings in the areas that are being replaced had hazardous materials in them, and the areas getting cleaned up. These are areas that were needed to be cleaned up anyway in some parts. Vacant buildings that weren't being used, and now the high-speed rail has use for it and is paying for it, and that's another positive aspect for Fresno. I just want to say that most of the money that my company is making, we're reinvesting in new equipment. All the equipment is the latest emissions, Tier 4 final, as far as the off-road equipment and new trucks. That's revitalizing, and that's expanding the job creation from the people who sell and rent equipment. I'm buying a lot of supplies and materials from distributors. Some are in the Bay Area, some are in Los Angeles. So that's improving their economy, so to speak. It has a broad reach other than Fresno, but speaking on behalf of Fresno, it has been a night and day improvement, something that we're all proud of. You could just see an excitement there, and we're just really grateful that the High Speed Rail Authority has chosen Fresno to start here, and given a small business and a disabled business the opportunity to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Leanne Eager, and I'm President and CEO of the Economic Development Corporation in Fresno County. I started working there about 7 years ago, which is 2009, right after Prop 1A was passed. And I think my first week on the job, someone came to me and said, we got to look into this high-speed rail thing because it might mean something for us here in the Valley. So it wasn't too long after that the federal government said, okay, we're going to start there in the Central Valley. Well, from then on, it was all bets are off, right? And as a recovering attorney, my job was really to look into all the aspects and make sure that this was going to be done correctly for my community and all those folks in the Central Valley and the state of California. So I think since then, I've gone to about 200 meetings. I've read every piece of paper that there ever is to ensure that what's going to happen in the Valley doesn't happen to our people, but with our people. One of the things that we have done, as Mr. Cachadorian talked about, is we looked at how to ensure that the local people were hired on this project. One of the things that I was involved with was the National Targeted Hiring Initiative to ensure that the people who needed the jobs were going to get the jobs. We had meetings with businesses up and down that alignment to let them know what was coming. We made sure that people that wanted to work on the project had the opportunity to work on the project. The other thing that is I think the hardest part of doing this work is we work with those folks that are on the alignment. There are about 330 businesses and people on the alignment that need our assistance. And one thing that the mayor of Fresno and the Board of Supervisors and the EDC said early on was, we're going to support this project because we believe in it, but not at any cost. And the cost was not about the money, because we know you'll figure out how to do that. The cost was to our local residents and our local businesses. So we jumped in and said they will have an advocate up and down that alignment. As we move people from place to place, we ensure that the rights are being met. And I tell you, there are 30% of all of the businesses so far that we've moved from place to place have increased their business. So they have expanded. What they've asked us to do is find a bigger spot for us because, as Paul said, a lot of those businesses were in blighted areas. They were able to move to another place and grow. We have been able to save about 3,000 jobs that are on that alignment to make sure that they stay in Fresno. 97% of those folks on the alignment are still in Fresno and still kept their businesses, and that was a goal of ours. But I think even bigger, the bigger piece for me has always been, what will this do for California? What will this do for the Central Valley of California? And I've ridden the high-speed rail in China, in Spain, and Italy, and France. And I've been able to look at stations in all of those areas, maintenance facilities in all those areas to look at what jobs might be. This last year, I was in Spain, and we rode the train from Madrid to Malaga. And that's probably about the same distance from San Francisco to Bakersfield. And when we got to Malaga, we met with the local people there and said, what did this do for your community? And what they came back and told us was they were a community that was based solely on folks coming there for to get away from the main cities. It was all about tourism. And that when the recession hit and tourism fell off, they were in big trouble. And they begged the Spanish group for a high-speed rail station there to connect them to the major metropolitan areas. Well, that hit home for me. Fresno is certainly, and the Central Valley is certainly ag-centric. And we believe in agriculture, we support agriculture, but when the recession hits and when agriculture gets hit, it affects us all. We've had double-digit unemployment forever. And so we're looking also at how do we look at branching out and ensuring that our economy can grow in other ways. Monday night, I met with the folks in San Francisco at the Bay Area Council and the folks in the tech community. And I talked about what this will mean for both our communities. And I think some folks here talked about, well, no one's going to get on a train and live in Fresno and work in San Francisco and come back. Well, that's not my goal. My goal is not for people to live cheaply in the Central Valley and work someplace nice in San Francisco. My goal is to get those folks in the Bay Area to expand their business into the Central Valley, because you can get your folks back and forth if you need to, but we want them to expand into the Valley. And in talking to the people Monday night, they're all in. They said, we've run out of space. We can't afford anything here anymore. So yes, we're absolutely looking for some place to expand that is affordable, that people can get to. I talked to a company that said, we're going to do our R&D in the Silicon Valley no matter what, so you can't talk me out of that. But right now, we manufacture our product in the Midwest because it's easier to get there than it is to get to the Central Valley. And I said, that's not acceptable. That's absolutely not acceptable. You're a California company. You should be manufacturing in California. I asked if high-speed rail would make a difference to them. They said, absolutely. Absolutely, that would make a difference. For us, it's that bigger picture. It's certainly important. These jobs are absolutely 100% important, and we're talking thousands of jobs. That's going to make a difference to us here. But I'm looking at this long term. What will this do for the state of California in that connectivity? And around the world, people are doing it everywhere, right? When you're looking at Spain, they took their train from Madrid to all parts of Spain and included the smaller cities, even though Fresno's not a smaller city. We have 500,000 people, right? It does include those smaller areas because they saw what connectivity does. They saw how it changes the economy. And that's what we want here. And I think I heard some folks here talk about, well, we had this company or this country that was willing to take it from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and they wanted to talk about their own route. Well, I know what that route was. It was down the 5, and it was going to bypass all of us in the Central Valley. And I'm offended by that. I'm offended by people who say, we don't really need to stop in the Central Valley because there's no people there. Well, certainly in the 8 counties of the Central Valley, there are 4 million people there. That is part of California. We should be connected to California, and this will allow us to do that. We're sort of an island unto ourselves right now because we're on the eastern part, and the western part gets connected, and somehow those of us on the eastern part get left out. This will allow us for that connectivity. And I think my friends from southern counties will probably tell you, and they've told me directly to me, that I'm this dreamer, right? And I have to tell them, you're absolutely right. I am that dreamer. I'm sorry. Because I do have this dream that someday we won't have that high unemployment in the valley. That we won't have the highest number of children in poverty in the entire country living in my community. That someday we won't have children that are suffering from asthma because of all of the pollution that we have in the valley. I have an 88-year-old grandmother. I have my daughter and my 2 granddaughters all have asthma. I have a dream that someday those kids can go to school and be able to go out on recess every single day and not have to worry about what that air quality looks like in the valley. So yes, I'm absolutely a dreamer, and I believe that this project will help me achieve that dream. Thank you.
Well, thank you. On that very optimistic note, we'll close out this panel, and I'll ask if there are any other members of the public who would like to speak. Please step forward.